Today is the 8th of April, 2026, and the most important news in the world right now isn't about what happened. It's about what didn't happen.
Exactly. The skies over Iran are quiet today, at least when it comes to American jets. For the first time in weeks, the bombers stayed on the tarmac.
It is a profound kind of silence, especially given the sheer velocity of the last month and a half. We are looking at a sudden, conditional 2-week suspension of all U.S. bombing and offensive military operations inside Iran. When you wake up to news like that, after weeks of relentless escalation, it feels like the entire globe just exhaled at once.
It really does. But that exhale might be premature. This isn't a peace treaty. It is a highly tactical, highly conditional pause pulled like an emergency brake by President Trump. And the condition is massive. Iran has to agree to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz for navigation.
The Strait of Hormuz. We always come back to that narrow stretch of water, don't we? It is the ultimate geopolitical choke point. But before we dive into the mechanics of this deal and what's happening in Islamabad, let's wind the clock back. To understand the gravity of no bombs falling today, we have to look at the timeline that brought us to the brink.
Right. You have to go back to late February of this year. That was the flashpoint. We saw the initial joint U.S.-Israeli strikes, which essentially kicked off this 2026 war. For weeks, it felt like a runaway train. We watched a rapid escalation of tit-for-tat military actions, moving from isolated skirmishes to a full-blown regional conflict.
And that train almost went completely off the rails just yesterday, or overnight into April 7, depending on your time zone. The U.S. launched what they called restrikes, and the target was Karg Island.
Which is the beating heart of Iran's oil export economy. Practically all of their crude oil exports flow through that single island. But here is the fascinating part, and really the key to understanding today's ceasefire. The U.S. strikes hit bunkers, radar installations, and ammunition storage. They deliberately bypassed the oil infrastructure itself.
It is like holding a scalpel to an artery, but only making a surface incision. You are showing them exactly what you could do without actually bleeding them out.
That is a perfect metaphor. Hitting the oil terminals would have sent global markets into an absolute death spiral and likely triggered an uncontrollable retaliation. By threading the needle, destroying military assets on the island while sparing the oil, the U.S. was sending a very loud, very precise message. We can dismantle your economy overnight, but we are choosing not to. Now, let's talk.
Which brings us to today. The gamble seems to have worked, at least for the moment. The White House, the Pentagon, and every major news outlet from CNN to Al Jazeera have confirmed the stand-down order. The U.S. has stopped its offensive operations. But let's look at the price of this pause, the Strait of Hormuz. Why is this the non-negotiable condition?
Because the strait is the jugular vein of the global economy. A massive percentage of the world's daily oil consumption passes through that bottleneck. When navigation there is threatened, shipping insurance rates skyrocket, supply chains freeze, and energy prices surge. The U.S. is essentially saying that a 2-week window for diplomacy is worthless if the global economy is suffocating in the background.
It is a hostage negotiation, but the hostage is global trade.
Precisely. And Iran seems to be showing some willingness to play ball. There are reports indicating they have accepted, or at least coordinated, on allowing safe passage through the strait. It is a pragmatic concession. They get a reprieve from the bombing, and the U.S. gets to stabilize the energy markets.
We are hearing that negotiations are set to begin very soon, likely in Islamabad, which is an interesting choice of venue. It positions Pakistan as this crucial intermediary. But I want to pivot to something that makes this whole situation incredibly fragile. The U.S. has paused its direct bombing, but Israel hasn't.
That is the ultimate wild card right now.
Exactly. Just yesterday, Israel was conducting separate strikes on Iranian railways, bridges, and other infrastructure. So, we have this bizarre reality where the US has declared a ceasefire, but its closest ally in the region is still actively hitting targets. How does a 2-week diplomatic window survive that kind of dissonance?
It barely survives. It requires an incredible amount of compartmentalization. The U.S. is drawing a hard line around its own military assets, effectively saying, "We are stepping back to the negotiating table." But Israel is fighting a war they view as existential, and their calculus is entirely different. They are degrading logistical networks, bridges, and railways to prevent the movement of weapons and troops.
So, you have negotiators sitting down in Islamabad, trying to hammer out a lasting agreement, while the echo of explosions is still ringing in the background. It makes you wonder about the illusion of control in modern warfare. We talk about pauses, and surgical strikes, and 2-week windows, as if war is a machine you can just unplug from the wall.
It is a very dangerous illusion. War isn't a machine, it is a fire. You can stop pouring gasoline on it, which is what the U.S. did today, but the embers are still burning fiercely, and the wind can change at any second. If one rogue missile hits the wrong target, or if a commercial tanker gets harassed in the strait despite the agreement, this entire diplomatic house of cards collapses instantly.
It really forces you to think about the psychological toll of living under that kind of uncertainty. Not just for the people on the ground in Iran, who woke up today to the relief of quiet skies, knowing it comes with a strict 14-day expiration date, but for the whole world. We are entirely dependent on the rational behavior of a few dozen people in war rooms and negotiating tables.
That is the profound cost of the era we live in. We have built a deeply interconnected global system, where a conflict in a narrow waterway dictates the price of bread and fuel thousands of miles away. And the technology of war has become so advanced, so devastatingly fast, that diplomacy is constantly playing catch-up. This 2-week window isn't just about finding a solution. It is about buying time to remember how to talk to each other before the missiles do the talking again.
And those talks in Islamabad are going to be agonizingly complex. What does a successful negotiation even look like here? Is it just a return to the status quo of January? Or are we looking at a fundamental redrawing of the security architecture in the Gulf?
I think a return to January is impossible. Too much blood has been shed, and too many red lines have been crossed since late February. The U.S. will likely demand verifiable, long-term guarantees regarding the Strait of Hormuz and the scaling back of certain military capabilities. Iran, on the other hand, will demand the permanent cessation of U.S. strikes and likely seek relief from the intense economic pressure. The gap between those two positions is the size of an ocean.
So these next 14 days are going to be a diplomatic marathon run at a sprint pace. Every statement from the White House, every movement of a ship in the Gulf is going to be scrutinized.
And they should be. The situation remains incredibly fluid. If there is a breach of the Hormuz conditions, or if the separate Israeli strikes trigger a massive retaliation, the U.S. bombers will be back in the air before the ink on any draft agreement is even dry.
It is a terrifying kind of leverage. We didn't drop bombs today so that we can sit in a room and talk about whether we will drop them tomorrow.
That is the dark reality of deterrence. It only works if the threat remains credible. The silence over Karg Island today isn't the sound of peace. It is the sound of a loaded weapon with the safety temporarily engaged.
Which makes the fact that the safety is engaged at all a monumental event. It is easy to get lost in the cynicism of geopolitics, but the reality is, a pause in the bombing saves lives today. It keeps the global economy breathing today. It is a fragile victory, but a victory nonetheless.
Absolutely. Diplomacy, no matter how tense or precarious, is always preferable to the alternative. The fact that all sides have agreed to step back from the abyss, even just for 2 weeks, shows that there is still a recognition of mutual destruction. No one actually wants to see the Strait of Hormuz turn into a graveyard of burning oil tankers. No one wants to see a total regional meltdown.
Let's hope that shared fear is enough to build a bridge in Islamabad. As we wrap up today's discussion, it is worth lingering on the date, the 8th of April, 2026, a day defined by restraint. We have traced the explosive path from late February to the surgical warnings on Karg Island yesterday, leading to this sudden, precarious silence.
The clock is ticking now. 14 days. It is a remarkably short amount of time to untangle a conflict of this magnitude.
It is. And it leaves us with a heavy question to ponder as we watch the news feeds. When you put a pause on a war, you aren't just stopping the violence. You are giving everyone a moment to look down at the wreckage. The question is, when this 2-week window closes, will the world decide to start cleaning up the debris, or will they simply reach for a bigger hammer? The answer to that will determine the shape of the decade to come. Keep your eyes on the straight and keep your ears open. The silence is loud right now, but what breaks it will change everything.